Hey everyone, welcome back to True Crime for Sleep Stories. Each night we take a quiet step into the darker side of the real world. Stories that are unsettling, mysterious, and true. They're not told to scare you, just to remind us how fragile normal life can be. So settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let the noise of the day fade away. And if you've been enjoying these calm, true crime nights, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps keep the stories coming. Now, take a slow breath, and let's begin tonight's case. Pine Bend Refinery sits in Dakota County, just south of St. Paul along the Mississippi River. In 1975, it was owned by Koch Industries and was one of the largest oil refineries in the Midwest. The area around it was industrial and semi-rural, warehouses, storage facilities, some farmland, intersected by highways and railroad tracks. It wasn't heavily populated, and at night, parts of the area were isolated and poorly lit. On July 14, 1975, a Monday morning around 8 a.m., two utility workers from Northern States Power Company were checking power lines along County Road 42, about half a mile from the refinery's main entrance. They were walking through an area of drainage ditches and overgrown vegetation when one of them spotted what looked like fabric partially hidden in tall grass at the bottom of a ditch. When they investigated closer, they realized it was a body, a woman wrapped in what appeared to be a military-style blanket, olive green, lying in the drainage ditch about 15 feet from the road. They immediately returned to their truck and called the Dakota County Sheriff's Department. I was assigned to work the case along with county investigators because the location was near state highway infrastructure. I arrived at the scene around 9:30 a.m. along with Sheriff's Detective Carl Henderson and the county medical examiner. The body was partially concealed by vegetation but visible once you knew to look. The woman had been wrapped in an olive green army-style blanket, wool, probably dating to the 1960s or early 1970s, the kind surplus stores sold or that veterans kept from their service. The blanket was wrapped around her body lengthwise and secured with rope at both ends. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chin, conducted a preliminary examination at the scene before the body was moved. The woman appeared to be in her mid to late 20s, Caucasian, with shoulder-length brown hair. She'd been deceased for approximately 2 to 4 days based on decomposition in the July heat. The cause of death appeared to be strangulation. There were visible ligature marks on her neck. She was fully clothed under the blanket, jeans, a plain t-shirt, work boots. There was no identification on her, no wallet, no purse, no jewelry, except for a simple silver ring on her right hand. Her pockets were empty. What struck us immediately was the motor oil and concrete dust. Her clothing, particularly the jeans and boots, had visible stains and traces of motor oil, the kind you'd get working around vehicles or machinery. There was also concrete dust on her jeans and shirt, suggesting she'd been in an environment with concrete work or construction. The body was transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The detailed examination confirmed strangulation as cause of death. She'd been strangled manually, likely with hands, then possibly finished with a ligature like a rope or cord. Time of death was estimated at some time between Friday, July 11th and Saturday, July 12th, approximately 2 to 3 days before discovery. There was no evidence of sexual assault. She appeared to be in generally good health, well nourished, no signs of chronic illness or drug use. Her teeth showed good dental care, several fillings done by a competent dentist. Her fingerprints were taken and sent to state and federal databases. No matches came back. She'd never been arrested, never been fingerprinted for any official purpose. Without identification, we focused on describing her physical characteristics and circulating that information. She was approximately 5 inches tall, 130 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. She had no distinctive scars or tattoos. She wore a simple silver ring and a size 7 in women's work boots. Her clothing was common: Levi's jeans, a plain t-shirt from a generic brand, boots that could be purchased at any farm supply or work clothing store. We created composite sketches based on her appearance and began the process of trying to identify her. Missing persons reports from Minnesota and surrounding states were reviewed. Several women matching her general age and description had been reported missing in recent months, but when we investigated further, comparing dental records, contacting families, none matched our victim. The investigation turned to understanding how she'd ended up in that drainage ditch and who'd killed her. The army blanket was examined thoroughly. It was a standard issue wool blanket, probably from the 1960s, in worn but serviceable condition. Thousands of these blankets had been distributed to military personnel and later sold as surplus. There was nothing distinctive about it that would help trace its origin. The rope used to tie the blanket was common nylon rope available at any hardware store. The knots were simple, not distinctive nautical or specialized knots that might indicate particular expertise. We investigated the area around where the body was found. The drainage ditch was alongside County Road 42, a moderately traveled road, but not heavily trafficked, especially at night. There were tire tracks on the shoulder near where the body had been placed, but the tracks were old and overlapping, impossible to isolate specific vehicles. We interviewed people who worked at or near the Pine Bend refinery, asking if anyone had been reported missing, if anyone knew of a woman matching the victim's description. We also asked about the motor oil and concrete dust. Were there areas of the refinery or nearby industrial sites where someone might get those particular stains? Several workers mentioned that the combination of motor oil and concrete dust was consistent with someone working in maintenance or construction around industrial sites. The refinery had ongoing maintenance work, and there were construction projects in the area, but none of the workers we interviewed recognized the victim's description, and personnel records showed no missing female employees. Then we got the witness report about the blue Ford pickup. A man named Harold Peterson, who lived in a house about a quarter mile from where the body was found, told us he'd been working in his garage late on Friday night, July 11th. Around 11 p.m., he'd heard a vehicle drive past slowly on County Road 42. He'd glanced out and seen a blue Ford pickup, probably from the late 1960s or early 1970s, with what looked like company markings on the door, though he couldn't make out what the markings said in the darkness. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Commercial vehicles drove that road regularly, but the truck had struck him as moving unusually slowly, and when he heard about the body being found, he'd wondered if it was connected. We checked with companies in the area that used blue Ford pickups with company markings. Several industrial services, construction companies, and utility companies used similar vehicles. We compiled a list and began interviewing employees and checking alibis. One company that came up repeatedly was a maintenance contractor that serviced equipment at the Pine Bend refinery. They had several blue Ford pickups matching the general description, and their workers would have had access to the types of environments that would leave motor oil and concrete dust on clothing. We interviewed all the employees of that contractor who had access to company vehicles. Most had alibis for the night of Friday, July 11th. They'd been home with family, or at bars with witnesses, or otherwise accounted for. But one employee, a man named Dennis Walsh, had no clear alibi. He said he'd been home alone that Friday night, his usual routine after work. Nobody could confirm or contradict that. Dennis Walsh was 42 years old, divorced, lived alone in a small apartment in South St. Paul. He'd worked for the maintenance contractor for about 3 years, had access to company vehicles, including blue Ford pickups. His work records showed he'd been on duty that Friday, had clocked out around 5 p.m., and hadn't been scheduled to work that weekend. We asked Dennis if we could look at the pickup he typically drove for work. He and his employer agreed. The truck was a 1971 blue Ford F100 with the company logo on the doors. We processed it for evidence, checked for blood, hair, fibers, anything that might connect it to the victim. The truck bed had traces of motor oil and general industrial grime, normal for a work vehicle, but nothing that definitively connected it to the crime. We asked Dennis about the Army blanket. He said he'd been in the Army in the early 1960s, had served in Vietnam. We asked if he'd kept any military items from his service. He said maybe. He wasn't sure. He'd have to check. With his permission, we searched his apartment. We found some military memorabilia, photographs, a uniform jacket, medals, but no Army blanket. We couldn't prove Dennis was involved. We had no physical evidence connecting him to the victim, no witnesses placing them together, no motive we could establish. The circumstantial evidence, his access to a blue Ford pickup, his work around motor oil and concrete, his military service and potential access to Army blankets, his lack of alibi, was suggestive but not sufficient for charges. We investigated other refinery workers and employees of nearby industrial sites, looking for anyone else who matched the profile and had opportunity. We found several men with military backgrounds, access to similar vehicles, and work environments consistent with the motor oil and concrete dust. None could be definitively connected to the crime. The victim's dental records were circulated to dentists throughout Minnesota and surrounding states. We asked if anyone recognized the specific pattern of dental work. No matches came back. We published her description and composite sketch in newspapers throughout the region. Tips came in. People thought she might be a missing relative or someone they'd seen at a bar or a worker who'd passed through town. Each tip was investigated. None led to identification. By the end of 1975, the active investigation had stalled. We'd exhausted our immediate leads, interviewed everyone connected to the area, followed up on every credible tip. The victim was buried in a cemetery in Dakota County in a plot donated by a local church. Her grave marker read, "Unknown woman, found July 14, 1975, known to God." The case remained open as an unidentified homicide. Over the years, whenever missing persons cases from the 1970s resurfaced, or whenever remains were found that might match her description, I'd check. None ever did. In the 1990s, DNA technology advanced enough that we could extract DNA from tissue samples preserved from the autopsy. The DNA profile was created and entered into CODIS and other national databases. It was compared against DNA from missing persons cases, and from family members searching for lost relatives. No matches came back. In the 2000s, the case was featured on websites dedicated to unidentified victims. Forensic artists created updated facial reconstructions showing what she might have looked like. Her case was included in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs. Despite this exposure and the efforts of amateur investigators and genealogists, she remained unidentified. I retired from the Minnesota State Patrol in 2002 after 32 years. The Pine Bend Jane Doe was one of several major unsolved cases from my career. I'm 85 years old now, living in St. Paul, and I think about her regularly. Over the 49 years since she was found, I've developed theories about who she was and what happened to her. The motor oil and concrete dust suggest she worked in an industrial or construction environment, possibly the Pine Bend refinery or one of the many industrial sites in the area. The fact that nobody reported her missing suggests she was either transient, estranged from family, or living a life where her absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. I believe she was killed by someone she knew from work, possibly Dennis Walsh or someone similar, a co-worker or supervisor who had access to the blue Ford pickup, who knew the area around the refinery, who had military connections explaining the Army blanket. There was a confrontation or relationship that went wrong, and she was strangled. The killer wrapped her in the blanket to transport her body without leaving evidence in his vehicle, drove to that drainage ditch late Friday night and dumped her there, hoping she wouldn't be found immediately, or that if found, she couldn't be traced back to him. That theory fits the evidence but can't be proven. Dennis Walsh remained in the area for several more years, then moved to Wisconsin in the early 1980s. He died in 2010, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. If he killed the Pine Bend Jane Doe, he was never held accountable. The woman's identity remains the central mystery. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why has nobody claimed her in 49 years? The most likely explanation is that she was someone living on the margins, maybe a transient worker, maybe someone with a troubled past who'd cut ties with family, maybe someone whose family didn't know where she was and didn't connect her disappearance to the Jane Doe found in Minnesota. The case remains officially open with the Dakota County Sheriff's Department. Her DNA is in national databases. Genetic genealogy, the technique that caught the Golden State Killer, offers hope. Investigators could potentially use her DNA to build a family tree and trace relatives who might lead to her identification. It's been done with other Jane Does from the 1970s, but it requires resources and time, and cold cases from nearly 50 years ago don't always get prioritized. What haunts me most is the complete anonymity. This woman lived for probably 28 or 30 years, had a childhood, had parents who raised her, had experiences and relationships. She ended up working in an industrial area of Minnesota in 1975, was killed by someone wrapped in an army blanket and left in a drainage ditch. And in 49 years, nobody has identified her or claimed her or explained what happened to her. She deserved better. She deserved to be known, to be identified, to be buried under her real name with her family able to mourn her. She deserved justice, her killer caught and held accountable. I couldn't give her those things. I investigated thoroughly, followed every lead, did everything I could with the resources and technology available, but it wasn't enough. She remains the Pine Bend Jane Doe, a nameless victim of an unsolved murder. But she's not forgotten. I remember her. Other investigators who worked the case remember her. People who've heard her story care about solving it. And someday, maybe through genetic genealogy, maybe through some other breakthrough, she might finally get her name back. Until then, she rests in that Dakota County cemetery, unknown but not uncared for. The cemetery staff maintains her grave, and occasionally people leave flowers, strangers showing compassion for a woman they never knew. She was real. She was a person who lived and worked and walked the earth for probably 30 years. She wore work boots and jeans stained with motor oil. She had brown hair and a simple silver ring. She deserved to live, to have a future, to be known by her name. I hope someday we'll learn who she was. I hope her family, if they're still looking, if they're still alive, will finally have answers. I hope her killer, even if long dead, will finally be identified, so there's at least historical justice. But even if none of that happens, even if she remains forever unknown, she'll be remembered. Her story will be told. She'll matter to the people who care about giving names back to the nameless. That's all I can offer now. Memory, hope, and the refusal to let her be forgotten. It's not justice, not identification, but it's something. And for a woman who died in July 1975 and was left in a drainage ditch wrapped in an army blanket, maybe being remembered is at least a start. She mattered, she was real, and she won't be forgotten. Not as long as there are people who believe every victim deserves a name and every death deserves to be solved. My name is Robert Manning, and I was a detective with the Vermont State Police for 35 years, from 1968 to 2003, working primarily in the Northeast Kingdom region. In that time, I investigated crimes ranging from burglaries to occasional homicides in Vermont's most rural and isolated areas. But in November 1972, I responded to a double murder at a small-town diner that became one of the most frustrating unsolved cases of my career, a crime where we had suspects, motives, and theories, but never quite enough evidence to bring anyone to justice. The Cold Hollow Diner sat on Route 105 in Enosburg Falls, a town of maybe 1,200 people in Franklin County, right up near the Canadian border. It was a classic American diner, chrome and red vinyl, a long counter with stools, booths along the windows, a menu featuring breakfast all day, and blue plate specials. The diner had been owned and operated by Clarence Devereaux, everyone called him Cliff, since 1965, and it was a local institution, the kind of place where farmers met for coffee before dawn, where truckers stopped for meals on the long hauls between Montreal and Point South. On the morning of November 16, 1972, a Thursday, a waitress named Martha Thompson arrived at the diner around 5:30 a.m. for her shift. The diner normally opened at 6 a.m., and Martha was responsible for setting up before the early morning customers arrived. When she tried the front door, it was locked, which wasn't unusual. The overnight person would keep it locked for security until the morning shift arrived. But when Martha knocked and called out, nobody answered. She could see lights on inside, which was normal, but something felt wrong. Martha walked around to the back door, which was used for deliveries and staff entry. That door was also locked. She knocked and called out again. No response. Growing concerned, she drove to a nearby gas station and called Cliff's house. His wife Eleanor answered and said Cliff had left for the diner around 10 p.m. the previous night, same as always when he worked the overnight shift. He should be there. Eleanor said she'd drive over to check. When she arrived at the diner around 6 a.m., she had a key and let herself and Martha in through the back door. The kitchen was quiet, lights on, everything appearing normal at first glance. But as they walked toward the front, they found Sally Pierce, the overnight cook, lying on the floor near the grill. She'd been shot, blood pooled around her upper body. Eleanor screamed and ran back toward the door, Martha following. They found Cliff in the front area of the diner, slumped behind the counter near the cash register. He'd also been shot, clearly deceased. Eleanor called the police from the payphone outside, while Martha stayed near the back door, too shocked to move. The Enosburg Falls Police Department responded first, followed shortly by the Vermont State Police. I was working that day and arrived at the scene around 7 a.m. The scene was methodical and cold. Cliff Devereaux, 54 years old, had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. Sally Pierce, 38 years old, had been shot once in the back. Both appeared to have been killed with the same weapon based on the wound characteristics, likely a .38 caliber revolver. The cash register was open and empty. Normally, there would have been the previous day's receipts and change for the next day, probably a few $100s total. The money was gone, but in Cliff's office in the back, a small safe sat closed and locked. When we opened it later with Eleanor's help, it contained about $3,000 in cash, receipts Cliff hadn't yet deposited at the bank. The killer had taken the register money, but either didn't know about the safe or didn't have time to open it. There were no shell casings, which confirmed the weapon was a revolver rather than a semi-automatic pistol that would eject casings. No murder weapon was found in or around the diner. Both the front and back doors had been locked from the inside. The killer had left and pulled the doors shut behind them, engaging the locks. The timeline appeared to be this. Cliff had been working the overnight shift, which he did several times a week. Sally came in around midnight or 1 a.m. to start prep work for breakfast, baking biscuits, preparing ingredients, getting things ready for the morning rush. Sometime in the early morning hours, someone had entered the diner, probably through the front door that Cliff would have unlocked for a late-night customer, had confronted Cliff and Sally, had shot them both, had taken the money from the register, and had left. We interviewed neighbors and anyone who might have been in the area during the overnight hours. A man who lived across Route 105 from the diner, Harold Chen, said he'd been up around 3 o'clock a.m., insomnia, he couldn't sleep, and had looked out his window. He'd seen a vehicle parked in front of the diner, a pickup truck, gray or light-colored. He couldn't be more specific about make or model, and he hadn't paid much attention because vehicles parked at the diner at all hours weren't unusual. We asked if he'd seen anyone, how long the truck was there, any other details. He said he'd noticed it when he got up around 3 a.m., and when he looked again, maybe 20 minutes later, it was gone. He hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the diner, hadn't heard gunshots. His house was well insulated and across a fairly busy highway, so sounds might not have carried. Based on the medical examiner's estimates, Cliff and Sally had probably been killed between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m., which aligned with Harold's sighting of the gray pickup. The investigation focused on several angles. First, the straightforward robbery scenario. Someone had come into the diner intending to rob it, had killed Cliff and Sally to eliminate witnesses, had taken the register money and fled. But that scenario had problems. If it was a simple robbery, why not force Cliff to open the safe? Why kill both victims rather than just restraining them? The violence seemed excessive for a robbery of a few $100s. Second, something more personal. Had Cliff or Sally been the specific target, and the robbery was staged to make it look like a random crime? We investigated both victims' backgrounds. Sally was a single mother of 2 teenagers, worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, had no known enemies or conflicts. She was well liked, hardworking, no reason anyone would want to harm her. Cliff was more complicated. He'd owned the diner for 7 years, was generally respected in the community, but there were rumors. Several people mentioned that Cliff had been involved in an illegal poker game that met weekly at a location that rotated between various establishments in the area. The games involved significant money, hundreds or thousands of dollars, changing hands each week. We investigated the poker game thoroughly. We identified several regular players and interviewed them. Most were local businessmen and farmers, people with money to gamble, but not necessarily criminal connections. They confirmed the games existed, said Cliff participated occasionally, but insisted it was friendly gambling. Nothing organized or connected to serious criminal elements. But one name came up repeatedly: Earl Pritchard, a man in his 40s who lived in Enosburg Falls and had a reputation as a troublemaker. Earl had been in and out of legal trouble, bar fights, a DUI, a conviction for assault several years earlier. Several people mentioned that Earl had been at the poker game the week before the murders, had lost significant money, and had gotten angry about it. We interviewed Earl at his home. He was defensive, admitted he'd been at the poker game, said he'd lost money, but that was part of gambling. He denied any conflict with Cliff beyond normal frustration about losing. We asked about his whereabouts the night of November 15th, 16. He said he'd been home alone, no alibi, but insisted he had nothing to do with the murders. We asked if he owned a gray pickup truck. He said no. He drove a sedan. We checked his vehicle registration. He did own a sedan, a 1968 Plymouth, dark blue. We asked if he owned any firearms. He said yes. He had a hunting rifle and a shotgun, both legal. He allowed us to examine them. Neither was a .38 revolver, and neither showed evidence of recent use. We couldn't prove Earl was involved, but he remained a person of interest. We kept tabs on him, checked his finances for any sudden influx of cash, talked to people who knew him, hoping someone would provide information that connected him to the crime. Nothing definitive emerged. The ballistic evidence from the crime scene, the bullets recovered from the victims' bodies, was analyzed. They were .38 caliber, consistent with being fired from a revolver, likely a Smith & Wesson or a similar common model. We checked gun registrations in Vermont and neighboring states, but in 1972, record keeping was spotty, and many firearms changed hands informally without registration. Finding the specific gun that had killed Cliff and Sally was nearly impossible without a suspect and weapon to test. We canvassed truck stops and businesses along Route 105, asking if anyone had seen a gray pickup around 3 a.m. on November 16th. We showed photos of Earl Pritchard, asking if he'd been seen in the area. We got vague recollections. Maybe someone had seen a similar truck. Maybe Earl looked familiar, but nothing concrete enough to build a case on. The investigation continued for months. We interviewed dozens of people, followed up on every tip, checked and rechecked every lead. The reward offered by Cliff's family and the community brought in additional tips, but none led to an arrest. By 1973, the active investigation had largely stalled. The case remained open, but without new evidence or witnesses, there wasn't much to pursue. Cliff and Sally were buried in Enosburg Falls. their funerals attended by much of the town. The Cold Hollow Diner was eventually sold by Eleanor Devereaux. She couldn't bear to operate it after what had happened, and new owners ran it for several years before it eventually closed in the 1980s. The building still stands, converted to other uses over the decades. I continued checking on the case periodically throughout my career, reviewing files, following up when new information occasionally surfaced. In the 1990s, DNA technology advanced enough that we could test biological evidence. Unfortunately, there was very little biological evidence from the Cold Hollow crime scene. No blood from the killer, no hair or fibers that could be definitively linked to the perpetrator. The .38 bullets were preserved, but without a weapon to test fire for comparison, they couldn't help us identify the killer. Earl Pritchard remained in the area for several more years, had additional brushes with the law, another assault charge in 1975, various minor offenses, but was never charged with the Cold Hollow murders. He moved to New Hampshire in the early 1980s and died there in 2004 from liver disease related to alcoholism, taking whatever secrets he had to his grave. I retired from the Vermont State Police in 2003 after 35 years. The Cold Hollow Diner murders remained one of my major unsolved cases. I'm 86 years old now, living in St. Albans, Vermont, and I still think about Cliff Devereaux and Sally Pierce regularly. Over the 52 years since they were killed, I've remained convinced that Earl Pritchard was involved. The circumstantial evidence, his participation in the poker game, his losses and anger, his presence in the community, his lack of alibi, his history of violence, all point to him. I believe he went to the Cold Hollow Diner around 3 a.m. on November 16, 1972, driving a borrowed or stolen gray pickup, intending to rob Cliff or to settle some score related to the poker game. He confronted Cliff and Sally, shot them both, took the money from the register, and fled before searching thoroughly enough to find the safe. But I can't prove it. Earl Pritchard is dead. The gray pickup was never identified. The .38 revolver was never found, and no witness definitively placed Earl at the scene. The case remains officially unsolved. Cliff's widow, Eleanor, lived until 2015, spending 43 years without justice for her husband's murder. Sally's children grew up without their mother, carrying that loss throughout their lives. The families deserved answers and closure that we never provided, but Cliff and Sally are not forgotten. I remember them. Other investigators who worked the case remember them. The people of Enosburg Falls who knew them remember them, and anyone who hears their story will know they were real people. Cliff, a diner owner working overnight to make a living. Sally, a single mother taking a prep cook job to support her kids, who were killed for what was probably a few $100s and an old grudge. They deserved to live, to see their families grow, to have futures. Instead, they were murdered in the early morning hours at a diner on Route 105, and their killer was never brought to justice. That failure has stayed with me for 52 years, but I can remember them, tell their story, and insist that they mattered. It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. And for two people who died working overnight at a small town diner, maybe being remembered is at least a start. Cliff Devereaux and Sally Pierce were murdered on November 16, 1972. Their killer was never caught, but they're not forgotten. They never will be. Rest in peace. You deserved so much better. On February 18, 1981, Ray Pedersen, a 56-year-old trapper who ran a seasonal line in the backcountry east of Anchorage, was snowshoeing through the area near Campbell Airstrip when he noticed something wrong. Even from a distance, he could see that the small hunting cabin belonging to Deke Havelock, a cabin he'd visited several times over the years, had been reduced to a blackened framework of charred logs. The fire had clearly happened days earlier. Snow had accumulated on and around the burned timbers, and there was no smoke or heat. Pedersen's first thought was that Havelock might have had an accident with his wood stove, a common enough tragedy in remote Alaska cabins during winter. As he approached, his concern deepened. In the dog pen, about 30 yards from the cabin, he could see dark shapes in the snow. Moving closer, he found Havelock's 3 sled dogs, a mixed team he'd used for hauling supplies, all dead, frozen in the positions they'd fallen. Pedersen didn't enter the burned cabin structure. He could see what appeared to be human remains inside, partially obscured by collapsed timber and debris. Following protocol for anyone who spends time in Alaska's backcountry, he marked the location carefully in his memory, returned to where he'd left his snow machine about 2 miles away, and drove directly to the nearest telephone at a gas station on the Glen Highway. The Alaska State Troopers were notified at 4:35 p.m. By the time Alaska State Troopers arrived at the remote site the following morning, a trip requiring snow machines and careful navigation in the February darkness, the scene had been secured as best as possible in wilderness conditions. Trooper Sergeant Michael Donahue led the initial investigation team, accompanied by a fire marshal investigator and a forensic technician. The location was about 12 miles east of Anchorage proper, accessible only by snow machine, dog sled, or small aircraft, landing on the frozen Campbell Lake in winter. The nearest road was miles away. This was exactly the kind of isolated location where people like Deke Havelock chose to live, away from society, largely self-sufficient, connected to the outside world only when they chose to be. The cabin had been a modest structure, approximately 16 by 20 feet, built from local spruce logs with a corrugated metal roof that had collapsed in the fire. What remained was the basic framework, the stone foundation and the wood stove, which had survived the blaze. Inside the remains, investigators found a human body, burned beyond immediate recognition, but positioned in a way that suggested the person had been lying down when the fire occurred, possibly in bed, possibly already deceased. Before examining the cabin itself, investigators documented the scene in the dog pen. 3 dogs, 2 males and a female, all mixed-breed working dogs, typical of Alaska bush teams, lay dead in the snow. Each had been shot, single shots to the head or chest at close range, execution style. This immediately transformed the investigation from a possible accidental fire to something far more sinister. The dogs hadn't died in the fire. Someone had deliberately killed them. Sergeant Donahue would later note in his report, "The killing of the dogs suggests planning and intent. Dogs serve as early warning systems in remote Alaska. Anyone approaching an isolated cabin will be announced by barking dogs long before they reach the door. Killing the dogs removes that protection and allows for a silent approach." The dogs had been in their pen, a fenced area where they were chained at night, which suggested they'd been killed either while Havelock was absent or by someone who approached openly enough that the dogs didn't perceive an immediate threat until it was too late. Fire Marshal Investigator Thomas Brenner conducted a careful examination of the burned cabin over 2 days, working in temperatures that hovered around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. His findings were significant. The fire had started inside the cabin, but not from the wood stove. The stove itself showed no signs of malfunction. Its door was closed, and the burn patterns indicated the fire had originated in the center area of the cabin's main room, not near the stove. Chemical analysis of the debris revealed traces consistent with kerosene or lamp oil, materials that would have been present in the cabin for lighting and heating. However, the burn patterns and the intensity of the fire in its early stages suggested these materials had been deliberately spread to accelerate combustion, not simply spilled accidentally. The walls of the cabin showed bullet holes, at least 4 that could be clearly identified, though the fire damage made it difficult to be certain of the exact count. The angles suggested shots fired from inside the cabin, but whether by Havelock defending himself or by an assailant was unclear. The body had been found lying on what remained of the bed frame, suggesting Havelock had either been asleep, incapacitated, or already dead when the fire started. Brenner's conclusion was unequivocal. This fire was deliberately set. The pattern of accelerant use, the point of origin, and the circumstances all indicate arson. Combined with the dead dogs and the bullet holes, this is clearly a homicide scene. Despite the severe burning, enough remained of the body for identification purposes. Dental records were requested from the VA hospital in Anchorage, where Havelock had occasionally received treatment, and they confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains were those of Donald D. Havelock, age 42. Havelock had been a known figure in the eastern Anchorage backcountry community, though community was a loose term for the scattered population of trappers, pilots, hunters, and others who lived off-grid in the area. Through interviews with those who knew him, investigators pieced together a picture of the victim. Donald Havelock had served in Vietnam from 1966 to 1968 as an Army infantryman. He'd seen heavy combat, particularly during the Tet Offensive, and had returned to the States with what friends believed was untreated PTSD, though in the 1970s the condition wasn't as widely understood or discussed as it would become later. After his discharge, Havelock had drifted through various jobs and locations before arriving in Alaska in 1973. Like many Vietnam veterans, he'd been drawn to Alaska's vastness, its distance from the lower 48, and the opportunity to live independently without much interference from society or government. By 1975, he'd established his cabin near Campbell Airstrip and had lived there year-round, largely self-sufficient. He trapped in winter, fished in summer, hunted for his meat, and made occasional trips into Anchorage to sell furs and buy supplies he couldn't produce himself: ammunition, kerosene, tobacco, and a few staples like flour and coffee. Friends described him as quiet, sometimes taciturn, but not unfriendly. He was known as competent in the bush, good with dogs, and someone who preferred solitude but wasn't hostile to visitors who respected his space and privacy. Deke wasn't running from anything specific, said Tom Granger, a pilot who'd known him for years. He was just done with civilization. Lots of guys like that in Alaska. The war did something to him, and he found peace out there in the woods. He wasn't paranoid or crazy, just wanted to be left alone. Investigators noted that Havelock's primary rifle, a Remington 700 in .30-06 that multiple people confirmed he owned and used regularly, was missing from the cabin. This was significant because in remote Alaska, a rifle is essential survival equipment. It would have been extremely unusual for Havelock to be at his cabin without it nearby. The missing rifle suggested either 1. Havelock had been away from the cabin when the attack occurred and hadn't had the rifle with him. 2. The killer had taken the rifle, either as a trophy or to eliminate a weapon that might have fired identifiable bullets. Other weapons that Havelock owned, including a shotgun and a .22 rifle, were found in the burned cabin remains, though too damaged to determine if they'd been fired recently. As investigators canvassed the sparse population in the area, a significant lead emerged. 3 separate individuals reported seeing or encountering an unfamiliar person in the days before Havelock's death. Martha and Jim Kowalski, who lived year-round at a cabin about 7 miles from Havelock's location, reported that a man driving a dark-colored station wagon, unusual for winter backcountry travel, had stopped at their place on either February 12 or 13. They couldn't remember exactly which day. The man had asked for directions to the Vietnam vet's cabin, or the guy who lives out by Campbell. Martha described him as white, probably in his 40s or 50s, with a heavy build, wearing a dark winter coat and a hunting-style cap. Jim remembered that the man had a lower 48 accent, not Alaskan, possibly from the Midwest. The Kowalskis had given general directions. They didn't know Havelock well, but knew approximately where his cabin was located, and the man had driven off. They hadn't thought much of it at the time. Visitors occasionally came out looking for trappers or homesteaders, usually friends or family from the lower 48. A pilot named Dave Morrison reported that while flying over the area on February 14th, he'd noticed a dark vehicle parked on the ice road near Campbell Lake. Unusual because very few people drove out there in winter. He hadn't thought much of it, assuming someone was ice fishing or accessing one of the cabins. But when investigators showed him a map, the location he indicated was within a mile of the route to Havelock's cabin. Ray Pedersen, the trapper who would later discover the burned cabin, mentioned that on February 15th, while running his trap line, he'd heard what sounded like several gunshots coming from the direction of Havelock's cabin. Gunshots weren't unusual in the backcountry. People hunted, practiced shooting, or dealt with predators, so Pedersen hadn't investigated. But, in retrospect, the timing seemed significant. Based on these reports and the condition of the burned cabin when found, investigators estimated that Havelock had been killed and the cabin burned sometime on February 15th or possibly early on February 16, 1981. Alaska State Troopers launched a comprehensive investigation, though they faced significant challenges. The crime scene was difficult to access, making it hard to bring in equipment or conduct extensive searches of the surrounding area while weather and light permitted. The sparse population meant very few people had seen anything, and those who had seen the stranger provided only general descriptions. The fire had destroyed much of the potential forensic evidence inside the cabin. No usable fingerprints survived. Any footprints around the cabin had been obscured by snow that had fallen after the fire. Multiple agencies across Alaska were alerted to watch for a dark-colored station wagon, particularly one with non-Alaska plates or driven by someone matching the description. However, no vehicle fitting the description was stopped or identified. Investigators pursued several angles. Given that the stranger had specifically asked for the Vietnam vet, investigators theorized this might be connected to Havelock's military service. Was there someone from his past, a fellow soldier with a grudge, someone involved in a wartime incident, a person seeking revenge for something that happened in Vietnam? The military provided Havelock's service records, and investigators contacted members of his unit. No one could think of any conflict or incident that would motivate someone to track Havelock down in Alaska years later and kill him. Havelock had been a regular infantryman, not involved in any controversial operations or incidents that anyone could recall. Investigators looked into whether Havelock had any personal enemies or conflicts. They interviewed everyone who had known him in Alaska. The consensus was that Havelock kept to himself, didn't owe money, didn't have romantic entanglements or property disputes, and generally avoided the kinds of interpersonal conflicts that lead to violence. Another theory was that this was a case of random or opportunistic violence. Perhaps someone from the lower 48 who had come to Alaska with criminal intent learned about an isolated cabin dweller and decided to rob or kill him. However, this theory struggled with the fact that nothing appeared to have been stolen except the rifle, and the deliberate nature of the killing suggested specific intent rather than opportunistic crime. The autopsy of Havelock's remains, conducted by the state medical examiner in Anchorage, was hampered by the severe burning but provided some crucial information. Havelock had been shot before the fire started. At least one bullet wound was identified, a gunshot to the upper chest or shoulder area. The bullet had passed through, so no projectile was recovered from the body. The medical examiner couldn't definitively determine if the gunshot wound alone would have been fatal, but it was certainly serious. However, Havelock had also died from smoke inhalation. His lungs showed evidence of having breathed in smoke and combustion products. This suggested a horrific scenario. Havelock had been shot, possibly incapacitated, but still alive, and then the fire had been set. He'd survived long enough to inhale smoke before dying, either from the gunshot wound, smoke inhalation, or the combination. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. As the investigation continued through the spring of 1981, detectives developed several working theories. The deliberate nature of the crime, traveling to a remote location, asking directions to a specific person, killing the dogs to eliminate warning, shooting the victim, and burning the cabin to destroy evidence, suggested this might have been a planned killing. But who would want Deke Havelock dead badly enough to travel to remote Alaska and execute him? And why? Investigators looked into Havelock's life before Alaska more deeply. They checked for criminal history, none. Financial records, minimal. He lived mostly off-grid, and interviewed his ex-wife, whom he'd divorced in 1971. She told investigators that Deke had been troubled after Vietnam, had struggled with alcohol, and their marriage had fallen apart, but she knew of no one who would want to harm him. She hadn't had contact with him in years. Perhaps the killer had believed Havelock had something valuable. Trappers sometimes accumulated significant cash from selling furs, and people living off-grid were rumored to keep gold or money hidden. But if robbery was the motive, why kill the dogs first? Why burn the cabin? And why had witnesses described the killer asking for the Vietnam vet specifically, as if he knew who he was looking for? One theory that gained some traction was that the killer had been looking for someone else, another Vietnam veteran, another person in the area, and had killed Havelock by mistake. The phrase, "the Vietnam vet's cabin," was vague enough that it could have applied to several people in the broader area. Perhaps the killer had been given incomplete or inaccurate information and had targeted the wrong person. The most likely theory, in the investigators' view, was that someone from Havelock's past, possibly from Vietnam, possibly from his life in the lower 48 before Alaska, had tracked him down for reasons known only to the killer. Perhaps it was related to something that happened in Vietnam that Havelock had never spoken about. Perhaps it was a personal conflict from his civilian life. Perhaps it involved money, a woman, or some other interpersonal issue that had festered for years before culminating in murder. By summer 1981, despite extensive efforts, the investigation had reached a dead end. No vehicle matching the description of the dark station wagon had been identified. No one matching the description of the stranger had been located or identified. No motive could be established with certainty. No forensic evidence linked any specific person to the crime. The case remained open, but without new leads, active investigation wound down. Alaska State Troopers periodically followed up on tips over the years, but none led anywhere productive. In 1985, a similar case occurred in the Yukon Territory. An isolated cabin dweller was killed, his dogs shot, and his cabin burned. Canadian authorities contacted Alaska State Troopers to compare cases. While there were similarities, the Canadian case was eventually solved as a local dispute, and investigators could find no definitive connection to the Havelock murder. In 1993, rumors circulated that a man dying in a hospital in Seattle had confessed to killing a guy in Alaska years earlier. Investigators followed up, but the man had died before they could interview him, and hospital staff couldn't confirm what he'd actually said. The rumor proved impossible to verify. In 2004, the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit reviewed the Havelock case with modern investigative techniques. Unfortunately, the physical evidence that remained was minimal. Photos and documentation from the original investigation, the autopsy report, interview transcripts. Some items recovered from the burned cabin that were too damaged to yield useful forensic evidence. No DNA evidence had been preserved that could be tested with modern techniques. The bullet that had passed through Havelock's body was never recovered, so ballistic analysis wasn't possible. The review confirmed what the original investigators had concluded. This was a planned murder, likely by someone who had traveled from outside Alaska specifically to kill Havelock, but without identifying the perpetrator. Retired Trooper Sergeant Michael Donahue, who led the original investigation and who passed away in 2019, shared his thoughts about the case in a 2015 interview. "I worked this case harder than almost any other in my career because it was so calculated and cold-blooded. Here's what I believe happened. Someone, a man from the lower 48, came to Alaska in February 1981 with the specific intention of killing Deke Havelock. He may have been a Vietnam veteran himself, may have known Deke from the service or from his life afterward. He came with a plan. He asked around until he got directions to Deke's cabin. On February 15th, he drove as far as he could, then either walked or snow machined to the cabin. He shot Deke's dogs first. He needed them quiet so he could approach without warning. Then he entered the cabin. Maybe Deke let him in. Maybe he knew him. Or maybe the guy had a convincing story. Or maybe he forced his way in. There was a confrontation. Shots were fired. The bullet holes in the walls suggest a struggle or exchange of gunfire. Deke was shot and wounded, possibly dying. The killer took Deke's rifle, maybe as a trophy, maybe because it had his fingerprints on it if he'd touched it, maybe just to prevent anyone else from using it. Then to cover his tracks and destroy any evidence, he poured kerosene around and set the fire. He left while the cabin burned, probably the same day, and drove back to wherever he'd come from. He got away with it because Alaska is vast, The location was remote, and by the time we found the scene, any physical evidence that might have identified him was gone. The snow covered his tracks, literally and figuratively. I believe this person probably died years ago. If he was Deke's age or older in 1981, he'd be in his 80s or 90s now if he's still alive. He probably never told anyone what he did. It's frustrating as hell, but sometimes that's how these cases end. Not with justice, but just with time passing until everyone involved is dead. The murder of Donald Deke Havelock remains an open case with Alaska State Troopers. It's listed in their database of unsolved homicides, and the case file is available to any investigator who might see a connection to other cases or have the new information. The area where Havelock's cabin stood has long since been reclaimed by nature. The foundation stones are still there, gradually being covered by vegetation and forest debris, but nothing marks the spot, except coordinates in the case file. Havelock has no known grave. His remains, after autopsy, were eventually cremated per standard procedures for unidentified or unclaimed remains, though in this case he had been identified. Without close family to claim them and arrange burial, his ashes were interred in a common memorial plot at the Fort Richardson National Cemetery in Anchorage, a resting place for veterans. The murder of Deke Havelock is almost certainly related to something in his past, his military service, his personal life, or circumstances that those who knew him in Alaska never learned about. Someone harbored enough anger, hatred, or motivation to travel to remote Alaska, track down an isolated cabin in winter, and commit a calculated murder. The killer was methodical. He eliminated the dogs, confronted Havelock, shot him, and burned the evidence. He then disappeared, probably returning to the lower 48, and was never identified or caught. This wasn't random violence or a robbery gone wrong. It was personal, deliberate, and planned. But without knowing what motivated it, what past connection or incident drove someone to kill, investigators could never identify the perpetrator. It's a frustrating reality of some cases. Even when you know a murder was committed and can reconstruct roughly how it happened without identifying a suspect or establishing a clear motive, you can't solve it. Deke Havelock survived Vietnam, built a life in Alaska's wilderness, and lived independently for years before someone from his past, or someone with a connection investigators never discovered, ended his life in a brutal, premeditated act. The killer got away with it not because of any great cleverness, but because of Alaska's vastness, the remoteness of the location, and the simple fact that in 1981, without witnesses or surviving physical evidence, there was no way to identify him. Justice wasn't served. The case wasn't solved. A man was murdered, and his killer was never held accountable. That's the honest, unsatisfying reality of this case. A reminder that not all crimes are solved, no matter how thoroughly they're investigated. And sometimes the only answer we have is that someone got away with murder. On Saturday, July 15, 1978, Harold Lowe, 26, and his wife Betty, 24, attended a family reunion at the rural property of Betty's aunt and uncle near Ava, Missouri, in the heart of the Ozark Mountains. The couple had been married for only 3 months, having wed in April in a small ceremony in Springfield where they both lived and worked. Harold as an assistant manager at a hardware store, Betty as an elementary school teacher. The reunion was a relaxed affair with about 30 relatives, featuring a potluck dinner, children playing in the yard, and adults sitting on the porch as the summer evening cooled. Multiple family members later told investigators that Harold and Betty seemed happy and relaxed, with no signs of marital trouble or personal distress. Around 10:30 p.m., as the gathering was winding down, the Lows said their goodbyes and climbed into Harold's 1975 Chevrolet C10 pickup truck for the drive back to Springfield, a journey of about 50 miles that should have taken roughly an hour and 15 minutes, mostly along Highway 5 and smaller county roads. Betty's aunt, Mary Ann Fletcher, remembered their departure clearly. Betty gave me a big hug and said what a wonderful time they'd had. Harold shook hands with everyone. They were laughing about something as they got in the truck. Just a normal, happy young couple heading home. They never arrived. When Harold didn't show up for his shift at the hardware store Sunday morning, his manager initially assumed he'd overslept or had car trouble. But when Betty's mother called the store around noon asking if they'd heard from the couple, she had expected Betty to call that morning, as she usually did after family events. Concern turned to genuine worry. By Sunday evening, when neither Harold nor Betty had contacted family or appeared at home, Betty's father, Robert Mitchell, contacted the Douglas County Sheriff's Office to report them missing. Sheriff's deputies began checking the route between Ava and Springfield, looking for signs of an accident or disabled vehicle. The search intensified after dark when it became clear the couple hadn't simply stopped somewhere or gotten delayed. Deputies were joined by volunteers from both families and local residents who knew the area well. The Ozarks presented challenging terrain, heavily forested hills, narrow winding roads, steep ravines, and countless unmarked dirt roads and logging trails that branched off from the main routes. At approximately 2:15 a.m. on Monday, July 17th, more than 24 hours after the Lows should have arrived home, a search party found Harold's pickup truck on a narrow dirt road called Blackjack Ridge Road, about 12 miles from the Fletcher property and well off the direct route to Springfield. The truck was still running, idling in the middle of the dirt road with both doors wide open. The headlights were on, casting long shadows into the surrounding forest. The keys were in the ignition. Both of Harold's hands were visible on the steering wheel, or rather, the impression suggested the truck had been left running by someone who had simply stepped away. Most disturbingly, Betty's sandals, white leather sandals she'd been wearing at the reunion, were lying in the mud about 10 feet from the passenger side of the truck, as if she'd stepped out quickly or they'd been pulled off her feet. Inside the truck, investigators found Betty's purse on the front seat, wallet intact with $47 in cash, and her identification. Harold's wallet was in the glove compartment with $83, credit cards, and his driver's license. His keys, including the house keys, were still in the ignition. A bag of leftovers from the reunion sat on the floor of the passenger side, still fresh, not spoiled. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, no broken glass or damage to the truck. The fuel tank was 3/4 full. Tire tracks showed the truck had been driven normally to this spot and stopped. There were no skid marks or signs of evasive driving. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office, recognizing this was beyond their normal scope, immediately requested assistance from the Missouri State Highway Patrol and brought in investigators with experience in missing persons and potential abduction cases. A thorough examination of the scene revealed several puzzling details. The area had received light rain earlier that evening, leaving the dirt road muddy in places. There were footprints leading from both sides of the truck into the surrounding forest. Footprints that appeared to match Harold's work boots and Betty's bare feet. Having stepped out of her sandals, the prints were clear for about 20 feet into the tree line, then became confused and unclear, eventually disappearing on harder ground and under the forest canopy. Crucially, there appeared to be no other footprints, no evidence of other people approaching the truck or leaving the scene. This puzzled investigators. If the couple had been forced from their vehicle, where were the perpetrators' tracks? Both doors being open suggested the couple had exited simultaneously or in quick succession, and neither had closed their door behind them. Behavior consistent with urgency or panic rather than a routine stop. There was no blood, no torn fabric caught on the door handles, no signs that anyone had been forcibly removed from the vehicle. If this was an abduction, it had been accomplished without visible violence at the truck itself. The truck had been idling for hours, running until the search party found it. This suggested whatever happened quickly enough that Harold didn't turn off the engine. On Tuesday, July 18th, as expanded search teams combed the forest around the truck, a volunteer searcher named Tom Garrett found Harold's wristwatch hanging from a low branch of a sycamore tree along Creek Hollow, a small stream about a quarter mile from where the truck had been found. The watch was a silver-toned Timex with an expansion band, definitely identified as Harold's by his family. It was hanging deliberately from the branch. The band looped around the wood as if someone had placed it there intentionally, not as if it had been accidentally caught while someone pushed through the brush. The location was puzzling. The watch hung about 5 feet off the ground, roughly at chest height, on a branch that overhung the creek. To reach this spot from the truck, one would have had to walk through fairly dense forest and cross or follow the creek. Why would Harold have removed his watch and hung it on a tree branch? Or if someone else had done it, what was the purpose? Investigators carefully documented the scene, photographed the watch in place, and then removed it for evidence. There was no blood on the watch, no damage to it. It was still keeping time correctly when found, though it had stopped at 3:47, presumably when the internal mechanism finally wound down after not being worn. Beyond the watch, no other personal items were found despite extensive searching. For 3 weeks, one of the largest search operations in Missouri history covered the area around Blackjack Ridge Road. The effort included over 200 volunteers at its peak, including family members, local residents, and people from across southern Missouri. Missouri State Highway Patrol, officers and investigators, search and rescue teams with trained tracking dogs, National Guard units who conducted grid searches of the heavily forested terrain, a helicopter from Springfield conducting aerial surveys. The Ozarks presented enormous challenges. The region is characterized by dense hardwood forests, steep hollows, limestone caves and sinkholes, thick underbrush, and terrain that can be treacherous even for experienced outdoorsmen. Visibility in the forest canopy is often limited to just a few feet in any direction. Search teams checked every cave system and sinkhole within a 5-mile radius, the creek and its tributaries for any signs the couple might have fallen into water, abandoned structures, old hunting cabins, and equipment sheds, mine shafts from historical lead and zinc mining in the area. Every logging road, trail, and path through the forest. Despite this massive effort, no trace of Harold or Betty Lowe was found beyond the truck, the sandals, and the wristwatch. Investigators from the Missouri State Highway Patrol led by Detective Sergeant Raymond Kohler, developed several theories about what might have happened. The most obvious explanation was that the couple had been abducted by someone who forced them from their vehicle. However, this theory faced several problems. Why would the couple have turned onto Blackjack Ridge Road in the first place? It was not on any route between the reunion and Springfield. Had they been forced to drive there at gunpoint? If so, why were there no signs of other vehicles at the scene? The lack of other footprints in the mud was difficult to explain. If abductors were present, where were their tracks? What was the motive? Nothing was stolen from the truck. There was no ransom demand. Neither Harold nor Betty had enemies or connections to criminal activity. Why would abductors hang Harold's watch from a tree branch? It seemed like an unnecessary and bizarre detail. Some investigators theorized that the couple might have encountered something, perhaps armed individuals, perhaps something else, that caused them to flee from their truck in panic into the surrounding forest. In the darkness and unfamiliar terrain, they could have become separated, disoriented, or injured. The Ozark Forest at night is profoundly dark, and it would be easy to become lost within minutes of leaving the road. This theory would explain the open doors, the running engine, Betty's abandoned sandals, and the footprints leading into the forest. However, it raised questions. What would have frightened them so badly that they fled without even turning off the truck or grabbing a flashlight? Why would Harold stop to hang his watch on a tree branch while fleeing in panic? How could two adults simply vanish in a search area that was covered so thoroughly? Perhaps the couple had stopped for some innocent reason, to look at something, to relieve themselves, to check something wrong with the truck, and had somehow encountered an accident. Falls into sinkholes or concealed cave openings are not uncommon in the Ozarks. Limestone karst topography creates hidden voids beneath seemingly solid ground. However, search teams had carefully checked every known sinkhole and cave entrance in the area. Investigators had to consider whether Harold and Betty might have staged their own disappearance. However, this theory had almost no supporting evidence. Both were happy in their marriage, according to all friends and family. Neither had financial problems, legal troubles, or reasons to flee their lives. They left behind all their money, identification, and possessions. Their families were close and loving. There was no estrangement or reason to cut ties. Nothing in their background suggested mental illness, delusions, or irrational behavior. Detective Kohler investigated this angle thoroughly, but found it implausible. These were normal, stable young people with everything to live for. The idea that they would abandon their lives, their families, and everything they owned to run off into the woods makes no sense. One aspect of the case that received attention in the press, though not from serious investigators, was the local folklore about the Ozark Lights, mysterious illuminated phenomena reported in the region for generations. Various residents of Douglas and surrounding counties had reported seeing strange lights in the forests at night, orbs, glowing shapes, or inexplicable illumination that seemed to move through the trees. These reports date back to the 19th century and are part of the broader category of ghost lights or spook lights reported in rural areas across America. Some locals, particularly older residents, suggested that the Lows might have encountered these lights and somehow been affected by them. A few claimed to have seen unusual lights in the vicinity of Blackjack Ridge Road on the night the couple disappeared, though these reports were vague and came after the fact. Detective Kohler addressed this directly in a 1979 interview. "We're investigating a missing persons case. possibly a double homicide or abduction. We're looking at evidence, witness statements, and physical facts. Ghost stories and folklore aren't part of serious police work. In reality, most ghost-like phenomena have prosaic explanations: car headlights reflecting off atmospheric conditions, piezoelectric effects from tectonic stress on quartz-bearing rock, bioluminescent fungi, or simply misidentification of ordinary lights in conditions of poor visibility. Through the remainder of 1978 and into 1979, investigators continued pursuing leads. Every person who had been at the family reunion was interviewed extensively. All were accounted for during the time the Lows would have been driving home. State police checked records of recently released criminals, known violent offenders, and anyone with a history of abduction or assault in Missouri and surrounding states. Several individuals were investigated and cleared. Harold's truck was processed thoroughly for forensic evidence. No fingerprints were found except those of Harold, Betty, and a couple of other people who were identified as having ridden in the truck previously for legitimate reasons. Investigators checked whether the couple might have picked up a hitchhiker, but none of the family members remembered seeing anyone else with them. And given the couple was traveling together late at night, picking up a stranger seemed unlikely. Financial records, phone records, and mail were monitored for months to see if either Harold or Betty attempted to access money or contact anyone. There was no activity. By mid-1979, with no new leads and no evidence, the active investigation was scaled back. The case remained open, but investigators had no clear direction to pursue. Over the decades, several developments brought renewed attention to the case. Hikers discovered skeletal remains in a remote area about 8 miles from where the truck was found. Forensic examination determined they were the remains of an adult male, but dental records and what skeletal analysis was possible at the time ruled out the remains being Harold's. The remains were eventually identified as those of a man who had been missing since 1972, unrelated to the Low case. A man dying of cancer in a Springfield hospital allegedly made statements to a nurse about knowing what happened to that couple in the woods. When investigators followed up, the man was semi-conscious and unable to provide coherent information. He died 2 days later. Investigators were never able to determine if his statements referred to the Lows or were the confused utterances of a dying man on heavy pain medication. With advances in DNA technology and forensic techniques, the Missouri State Highway Patrol Cold Case Squad reviewed all evidence from the Low disappearance. Unfortunately, there was no biological evidence to test. No blood, no tissue, nothing that could yield DNA. The physical evidence that existed, tire tracks, footprints, photographs, was reviewed but revealed nothing new. Cave explorers mapping an extensive cave system in Douglas County discovered a previously unknown section that included a deep vertical shaft. The shaft was explored by specialized cave rescue teams, but no human remains or evidence was found. Several other newly discovered caves and sinkholes have been investigated over the years with similar results. In 2018, retired Detective Sergeant Raymond Kohler, now in his 80s, was interviewed for a retrospective article in the Springfield News Leader. He shared his conclusion after decades of consideration. I've thought about this case for 40 years. Here's what I think happened, though I can't prove it. Harold and Betty were driving home, probably took a wrong turn in the dark. Those back roads all look the same at night, especially if you're not familiar with the area. They ended up on Blackjack Ridge Road, realized they were lost, and stopped to figure out where they were. While they were stopped, someone else came upon them. Maybe someone local who was out there for their own reasons, poaching, running moonshine, hiding from the law, or just someone who lived back in those hills and didn't like strangers on what they considered their territory. This person or persons confronted Harold and Betty, maybe with a gun, forced them out of the truck. Maybe the intention was just to scare them off. Maybe it was robbery that went wrong when they found nothing worth taking. Maybe it was something worse from the start. The couple was marched into the woods. That's when Betty lost her sandals, moving quickly over rough ground. Harold's watch might have caught on a branch and pulled off, and someone hung it there afterward, or Harold himself put it there as a marker, hoping it would be found and give searchers a direction. What happened next, I don't know, but I believe both Harold and Betty were killed somewhere in those woods, and their bodies were concealed, maybe in a cave or sinkhole that we never found, maybe buried, maybe in a location so remote that searchers just never reached it, despite our best efforts. The person or persons responsible are probably dead by now. This was 40 years ago. If they were adults then, they'd be elderly or gone now, and they probably took the secret with them. The hardest part is knowing that we came so close. We found the truck within hours. We searched for weeks, but the Ozarks are vast, and if someone wants to hide something in those hills, it can stay hidden forever. The case of Harold and Betty Lowe remains open with the Missouri State Highway Patrol. In 2023, the case file was digitized as part of a project to preserve older case records, making it accessible to investigators using modern analytical techniques. Periodically, the case receives renewed attention when it's featured in true crime media, generating tips that are investigated but have so far led nowhere. Harold and Betty were declared legally dead in 1985, 7 years after their disappearance, allowing their families to settle estates and gain some legal closure, though not emotional closure. Both sets of parents have since passed away without ever learning what happened to their children. Siblings and extended family members continue to hope for answers. The disappearance of Harold and Betty Lowe is tragic not because of supernatural elements or mysterious lights, but because it represents something more common and more disturbing: the human capacity for violence and the reality that remote areas can conceal crimes effectively. The most probable explanation is the simplest. The couple encountered someone in a remote location. Something went wrong, and they were killed. Their bodies remain undiscovered because the Ozarks encompass thousands of square miles of rugged, forested terrain, with countless places a body could remain hidden indefinitely. Collapsed caves, deep sinkholes, buried graves, or simply locations so remote that no one has walked there in the decades since. The Ozark Lights were a distraction, a piece of folklore that made the story more mysterious but had nothing to do with what actually happened. Two young people disappeared, almost certainly victims of foul play, and the person or persons responsible got away with it. That's not a satisfying conclusion in the sense of providing complete answers or justice, but it's the most honest assessment based on the evidence. A crime occurred, the perpetrators were never caught, and the victims' remains were never recovered. It's a cold case that will likely remain cold, not because of anything mysterious or unexplainable, but simply because sometimes, despite best efforts, crimes go unsolved. The Lowes are remembered by their families, their disappearance is documented in law enforcement records, and their case remains open on the possibility that someday someone will find something that provides a definitive answer. But after nearly 50 years, that possibility grows dimmer with each passing year. What we're left with is the memory of two young people who loved each other, were starting their life together, and whose story ended on a dark road in the Ozarks on a summer night in 1978. A reminder that tragedy can strike suddenly, senselessly, and sometimes without resolution. Whitewater Creek runs through rural Baldwin County in southwest Alabama, an area of pine forests, small farms, and scattered communities. In 1987, the region was relatively undeveloped, with long stretches of wooded land between towns. A natural gas company had contracted to lay pipeline through the area, a project that required clearing routes through forest and excavating trenches for the pipes. On April 22, 1987, a Wednesday afternoon around 2 p.m., a construction crew working about 8 miles northwest of the small town of Stockton was excavating with a backhoe when the operator noticed something unusual in the dirt. He stopped immediately and called his supervisor. They'd found bones, human bones, clearly visible in the excavated soil. The Baldwin County Sheriff's Department was notified, and I was dispatched from the State Bureau to assist, given the potential complexity of the case. I arrived at the scene around 4:30 p.m., along with the county medical examiner and a forensic anthropologist from the University of South Alabama. The construction site was isolated, accessible only by logging roads that wound through thick pine forest. Whitewater Creek itself was about 50 yards away, a slow-moving stream that flooded seasonally. The area where the bones had been found was slightly elevated, which had probably protected the burial site from complete erosion over the years. As we carefully excavated and examined the site, the scope of what we'd found became clear. There were 3 bodies buried side by side in shallow graves, maybe 3 feet deep, oriented in the same direction, 2 adults and 1 child, based on the size and development of the skeletons. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Patricia Martinez, conducted preliminary examinations at the scene before the remains were removed for more detailed analysis. Based on bone structure and size, she determined skeleton hash 1 leftmost, adult male, approximately 25, 35 years old at time of death, around 5'9" inches to 5'11" inches tall. Skeleton hash 2, center, adult female, approximately 25, 35 years old, around 5'3" inches to 5'5" inches tall. Skeleton hash 3, rightmost, child, approximately 9 years old, sex difficult to determine from skeletal remains at that age. The bodies had been buried in everyday clothing. Remnants of fabric were found with each skeleton. The adult male wore what appeared to be jeans and a button-up shirt. The adult female wore jeans and a blouse. The child wore pants and a t-shirt with traces of what might have been a cartoon character, though decomposition had made it unidentifiable. Most significantly, with the adult male skeleton, we found a class ring. It was tarnished, but still legible, gold-colored metal with a blue stone, engraved with ECHS, 77 inches on one side, and what appeared to be a name on the inside band, though the inscription was too worn to read clearly. The positioning of the bodies, side by side, buried together, all facing the same direction, suggested they'd been killed around the same time and buried deliberately in this remote location. Dr. Martinez estimated based on decomposition and the condition of the remains, that the burials had occurred approximately 8 to 12 years earlier, probably between 1975 and 1980. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the State Medical Examiner's office in Mobile for complete forensic analysis. Over the following weeks, detailed examinations were conducted. The adult male had suffered trauma to his skull, a depressed fracture at the back of the head consistent with being struck with a heavy object. This was likely the cause of death. The adult female's skeleton showed no obvious trauma, but strangulation or suffocation wouldn't necessarily leave marks on bones. The child's skeleton also showed no obvious skeletal trauma. The lack of clothing buttons, zippers, or other metal fasteners made precise identification of the clothing difficult, but fabric analysis suggested common American-made clothing from the 1970s. Nothing distinctive or unusual. The class ring became the focus of the investigation. ECHL 77 inches clearly indicated Escambia County High School, class of 1977. Escambia County bordered Baldwin County to the west, with the county seat in Brewton, Alabama. I contacted Escambia County High School and obtained yearbooks and graduation records from 1977. There were about 120 students in that graduating class. We identified all male graduates and began the process of locating them or confirming they were accounted for. This was tedious work. Many graduates had moved away after high school, to college, to jobs in other states, to military service. We had to track them down through DMV records, voter registrations, employment records, family members. Over several months, we accounted for all but about 15 male graduates from the class of 1977. Of those 15, most were eventually located, living in other states, some deceased from natural causes or accidents with death certificates to prove it. But 3 remained unaccounted for after exhaustive searching. They'd essentially vanished after high school with no clear trail. Any of them could have been the adult male buried at Whitewater Creek. We focused on those 3, Michael Henderson, Robert Kimball, and James Jimmy Patterson. All 3 had left the Brewton area shortly after graduation. Michael Henderson's family said he'd talked about going to Texas to work in the oil fields and they'd lost contact. Robert Kimball's family said he'd joined a traveling carnival and they'd received occasional postcards, but nothing in recent years. Jimmy Patterson's family said he'd gotten mixed up with drugs and had drifted away, possibly to Florida. We tried to obtain dental records for all 3, hoping to match them against the adult male's teeth from Whitewater Creek. This proved extremely difficult. Michael Henderson had never had regular dental care, and his family couldn't locate any dentist who treated him. Robert Kimball's childhood dentist had retired and his records were lost. Jimmy Patterson's dental records were eventually located, but when compared to the adult male skeleton's teeth, they didn't match. Jimmy Patterson was ruled out. That left Michael Henderson and Robert Kimball as possibilities, but without dental records or other definitive means of identification, we couldn't determine which one, if either, was the victim. We tried to identify the adult female and child. If we could determine who they were, it might lead us to identifying the adult male. We checked missing persons reports from the late 1970s throughout Alabama and neighboring states, looking for cases involving a man, woman, and child missing together. We found several cases that seemed potentially relevant at first, but when we investigated further, they didn't match. One family reported missing in 1978 had eventually been found living in California. They'd left to escape debt. Another missing persons case involved a different number of children. A third case involved a woman and child, but no man. We also considered that this might not be a traditional nuclear family. Maybe the adult male and female weren't married, or the child wasn't biologically related to both adults. Maybe they were traveling companions, or the child belonged to one adult and not the other. The investigation looked at the location where the bodies were found. Why Whitewater Creek? It was remote, unlikely to be disturbed for years, accessible by logging roads, but not easily found by casual visitors. Whoever buried these three people knew the area or had scouted locations carefully. We interviewed longtime residents of Baldwin County, asking if anyone remembered a man, woman, and child going missing or disappearing from the area in the late 1970s. Nobody could recall such a case. We checked with law enforcement in surrounding counties, asking if they'd had similar cases. Families disappearing, bodies found in remote locations. Nothing matched. We investigated the possibility that the victims were transients or drifters. The late 1970s saw significant numbers of people traveling around the country, hitchhikers, seasonal workers, people living on the margins who wouldn't necessarily be reported missing in official channels. If this family had been drifting through Alabama in the late 1970s, they might have encountered someone dangerous, been killed, and buried in this remote location with nobody ever officially reporting them missing. That theory fit some facts, but had problems. The class ring suggested the adult male had roots in Escambia County, had graduated from high school there. That didn't fit the profile of a complete transient unless he'd graduated, then left the area and fallen into a transient lifestyle, which was possible. We also investigated locals who might have had opportunity and means to commit the murders. We checked for sex offenders, violent criminals, people with access to the remote areas around Whitewater Creek. We found a few individuals with concerning histories, but none could be connected to the murders or to the missing men from Escambia County High School. By 1988, the active investigation had largely stalled. We'd exhausted our obvious leads, checked every missing persons case we could find, interviewed dozens of people. The three bodies were buried in a cemetery in Baldwin County with a shared marker reading, "Unknown family, found April 22, 1987. Rest in peace." The case remained open as an unidentified triple homicide. Over the years, I'd periodically review the file, check new missing persons cases, hope for a break. In the 1990s, DNA was extracted from the remains and profiles were created. The DNA was entered into national databases and compared against missing persons cases. No matches came back. DNA testing also confirmed that the adult male and female were not closely related. They weren't siblings. The relationship between them and the child couldn't be definitively determined without comparative DNA, but the fact that they were buried together suggested some familial or close connection. I retired from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation in 2008 after 33 years. The Whitewater Creek skeletons remained one of my major unsolved cases. I'm 86 years old now, living in Mobile, and I think about those three people regularly. Over the 37 years since they were found, I've developed a theory about what happened. I believe the adult male was likely Michael Henderson or Robert Kimball from the Escambia County High School, class of 1977. The class ring provides strong evidence of that connection. After graduating, he left the Bruton area, got involved with a woman, possibly someone he met while traveling or working, and they either had a child together or were caring for a child from a previous relationship. In the late 1970s, probably 1978 or 1979, they were traveling through or staying in rural Alabama when they encountered someone dangerous. Maybe they were hitchhiking and accepted a ride from the wrong person. Maybe they were working at a farm or facility where the owner was violent. Maybe they witnessed something illegal, drug trafficking, other criminal activity, and were killed to silence them. The killer or killers took them to the remote area near Whitewater Creek, killed them, the adult male with a blow to the head, the woman and child by means that didn't leave skeletal evidence, and buried them together in shallow graves. The location was chosen because it was isolated, unlikely to be disturbed, and accessible by someone who knew the area. The victims were never reported missing because they'd been living on the margins, had lost contact with family, and were traveling without anyone tracking their movements. The adult male's family in Escambia County might have assumed he was still alive somewhere, just out of touch. Not unusual for young men who left small towns in the 1970s. That theory fits most of the evidence, but can't be proven without identifying the victims. And after 37 years, the chances of identification remain small, despite advances in DNA technology. Genetic genealogy offers some hope. Investigators could potentially use the DNA from the 3 victims to build family trees and identify relatives. If Michael Henderson or Robert Kimball had siblings or other family members who submitted DNA to ancestry websites, investigators might be able to connect them. It's been done with other unidentified victims from the 1970s and 1980s, but it requires resources, time, and access to genealogists skilled in this work. Cold cases from nearly 4 decades ago don't always get prioritized for such intensive efforts. What haunts me most is the completeness of their erasure. 3 people, likely a family or family unit, were killed and buried in the woods, and in 37 years, nobody has definitively identified them or come forward to claim them. They lived for years, had childhoods and experiences and relationships, and then they simply vanished, leaving behind only bones and a class ring. The child haunts me particularly, 6 to 9 years old, too young to have done anything to deserve what happened. Whatever the circumstances that led the adults into danger, that child was innocent, was there only because they were with the adults, and that child has been dead and unidentified for over 40 years, buried in an unmarked grave with nobody to remember their name. They all deserve better. The adult male deserved to have his name back, to be identified as Michael Henderson or Robert Kimball or whoever he was. The adult female deserved to be known, to be mourned by whatever family she had. The child deserved to have lived a full life, to have grown up, to have had a future. I couldn't give them those things. I investigated thoroughly, followed every lead, did everything I could with the resources available. But it wasn't enough. They remain the Whitewater Creek skeletons, 3 nameless victims of an unsolved murder, but they're not forgotten. I remember them. Other investigators who worked the case remember them. The people who've heard their story care about solving it. The case remains officially open with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation and the Baldwin County Sheriff's Department. The DNA profiles are in national databases. The class ring is preserved as evidence. And if anyone comes forward with information, if genetic genealogy produces leads, if any new evidence emerges, investigators will follow up. Until then, they rest in that Baldwin County cemetery. 3 people who died together and were buried together, whose names and stories remain unknown, but they're not uncared for. The cemetery maintains their grave, and occasionally people leave flowers or small mementos, strangers showing compassion for victims they never knew. They were real. They were people who lived and breathed and walked the earth. A man who graduated from high school in 1977, a woman who was with him, a child who was just beginning life. They deserved to be known, to be remembered by their real names, to have their deaths investigated and solved. I hope someday they'll get their names back. I hope their families, if anyone is still looking, if anyone is still alive, will finally have answers. I hope the person who killed them, even if long dead, will be identified, so there's at least historical justice. But even if none of that happens, they'll be remembered. Their story will be told. They'll matter to people who care about the lost and nameless. That's all I can offer now. Memory, hope, and the promise that they won't be forgotten. It's not justice, not identification, but it's something. And for 3 people buried together in the Alabama woods in the late 1970s, maybe being remembered is at least a start. They mattered. They were real, and they won't be forgotten.